couple requests from students at the U who have class or work right now who can't be here, who wanted to be able to hear this conversation. So our panelists were okay with recording this, and I'll figure out some way to distribute it to folks afterwards. What I thought I would do, so just so you know, the plan is to have this run, if it goes that long, until 5:30, and then I think we'll cut everybody loose then, just to give folks a chance to head towards dinner and whatnot. And I know that Nono has already had a busy day of meetings.
I haven't had dinner.
And you haven't had dinner, and a hungry No-No is a grumpy No-No, so we don't want that. So what I might do is start by introducing each of our three panelists, and maybe have each of you say a bit about your own educational background, and then your either prior or current experience with a museum career. And after each of you had a chance to sort of say a bit about yourself and who you are, then I think what we'll do is just go to question and answers. And what I might have you do, maybe the easiest way to do that is if you have a question, if you would chat that you have a question, chat your name or something at me, and then I can call you in the order that I get you in my chat, just so that way we don't have kind of a cacophony of people trying to start each round of questions. So if you would send a chat to me, and I'll try to call you in order as you show up, and we'll see how this goes. And if you get out of hand, I'll remove you from the meeting. That's not actually, I won't actually do that. So why don't we start with Laura Vietti. Laura, what's your educational background? How did you get roped into doing this? And what is your experience and career in museums?
Sure. So, Laura Vietti, I am currently at the University of Wyoming. I am the museum and the collections manager, which I'll talk a little bit about in a bit. But background is a geology degree. And then I skipped my master's and I went straight into a PhD to work with Dave and Ray Rogers and Jake Bailey. It was a very evolving PhD. So I got my PhD at the University of Minnesota. During the PhD though, especially in the writing process, I realized that R1 academia was not for me. So that's when I started looking for jobs that were more museum and outreach related. I also, before I entered graduate school, I had quite a bit of experience working in museums under my belt as a high schooler and also as an undergrad researcher or undergrad. So so my experience with museums as an undergrad plus my research experience, getting my doctorate at Minnesota, both put me in a really good position to get a museum position here in Wyoming. So,
what are your official positions there, and what does that entail? What are your responsibilities?
Yeah, so the University of Wyoming, we're pretty small. We have about 12,000 people, undergrads, and about 1,300 graduate students. But we have this, so this is my museum in the background. I'm actually at home. This is just a screenshot. But we have a museum that is attached to the geology department. And we also have a pretty expansive fossil collection. We are considered a small fossil collection, so we have about 40,000 specimens. And so I manage both the fossil collections, I manage the museum, I manage students, internships, I manage a fossil prep lab, or a rock prep lab that's downstairs. Basically, I do all of it. I do everything. And so in some ways that's really good. In other ways, it's basically doing the job of 10 people in one. So I have full control, more or less, which is really nice. I don't have a board that I have to respond to. But at the same time, it comes with a challenge.
Cool. And what year did you start at the University of Wyoming?
2014. So I've been here for 6 years.
Okay, great. Okay, wow. So as I indicated in the email, I invited Laura in part because she's one of my students, one of my former students, but also Laura is representing a smaller, more regional museum at a public institution. And so it's kind of one category of museum that is out there in the world. Um, why don't we go next to Johan Nono Lascu? Nono, why don't you tell us a bit about your own background, educational, and how you ended up where you are and what you do there?
Sure. I am at the National Museum of Natural History as part of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. I've been here 2.5 years. And previously, I got a degree in geology, a bachelor's degree in geology from the University of Cluj in Romania. And then I jumped across the pond to Mississippi State, where I got a master's degree. And I started in 2005 at the University of Minnesota in a PhD program, and got my PhD in 2011, mainly working in the Institute for Rock Magnetism and LACOR, the Limnological Research Center. And then I spent the last year of my PhD and first year of postdoc at Minnesota teaching, both at Minnesota and at Normandale Community College, while I was doing a postdoc with Josh Feinberg, who I think is here. And then I moved to Cambridge in the UK for 4 years, did a full-blown postdoc there. And after that, I came to the Museum of Natural History in DC with no experience whatsoever to be a museum curator. My title is research geologist / curator. And right now I am mostly doing research, but I'm also involved in sort of with the division of mineralogy in our department, which is Department of Mineral Sciences. And I can talk a little bit about how the museum is organized later, if you want to.
Okay, that would be great. And no, is it true that, and so you all will hear me refer to Johan as No, which is kind of his nickname, and for many of his friends, his real name. Do you go by Johan or No at the museum?
Johan, yep.
Oh, whatever. Is it true that your position is basically Cara Santelli's position at the Smithsonian? Is that correct?
No, it's my position.
But was it hers before?
No, it's a different position.
Okay.
He was a federal employee. I am a trust-funded employee right now.
I see.
And I came in on a secretarial scholarship. So it's a 5-year trust-funded position, and then it will get converted into a federal position, given a number of circumstances that need to fall into place.
Right. Okay. Great. Thank you. All right, Pete. Same to you. Why don't you tell us a bit about your background and your former experience in museums, at least as a curator, and how you ended up here.
Yeah. I sort of represent the third leg of the museum stool, so to speak, which are the large private, that is non-federal, non-state type museums. So institutions like the American Museum in New York or the Field Museum in Chicago, or even locally, the Science Museum of Minnesota. So these are nonprofit in educational institutions, but they are essentially private in the sense that they don't have a state or governmental affiliation. So my long sort of trajectory through museums started with my master's. So I studied, I was a biology student at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. And then as part of we had a 5-year program. So it was sort of, you didn't do a separate bachelor's and master's. You just kind of did 3 years. That was called your bachelor's, and then immediately added 2 years on as a master's. So it was a 5 years master's type deal. And for my research, I decided I wanted to work on dinosaur systematics. I went to the Tyrrell Museum in Canada, which is a provincial museum funded by the government of Alberta, and was built in 1985, kind of out in the Badlands there, where there's a long and rich history of dinosaur hunting. So I spent about a year there, but my degree was actually through the University of Copenhagen. But I really got the museum bug, like the field work, like the whole sort of public education through exhibits and interactives. And then when I was applying for PhD programs, one of the main places I wanted to go was to Columbia University in New York, because they had about a century-old connection to the American Museum of Natural History, which was the real draw for me. And I was admitted there, and basically spent the bulk of those 5 years not on campus, but at the American Museum on Central Park West, and working, you know, on systematics and evolutionary history of various dinosaur groups, and got my PhD there. And was very lucky to actually interview for my first academic job before I even finished. So I interviewed at the Field Museum. God, when was this? 2000. And moved from, was lucky enough to get the job, moved from New York to Chicago in July of 2001, which was kind of lucky in a way. I'm thinking of what happened in September of 2001, but so I then spent the next 18 years as a curator at the Field Museum in Chicago. So my title literally was Curator of Dinosaurs. So the way a lot of these private museums are organized is that curators, which are sort of their equivalent of research positions, so essentially corresponding roughly to a professorial position at a university, but in place of teaching, you have responsibilities for curation of collections. So I did that for 18 years. And the interesting thing is unlike universities where, you know, you may have a set number of faculty lines, but what they're dedicated to will change with the times and sort of perceived needs in teaching and research. Museum, especially private museums, tend to actually have their curatorial lines tied very closely to the collections. So you'll have a curator of fossil reptiles, or a curator of fossil mammals, or curator of fossil plants, or, you know, if you're over in anthropology, you'll have a curator of African archaeology or what have you. So one of the important sort of differences between the museum world and the university world is this very strong mission focused on the collections. And in fact, all of these larger museums will have a charter in which the center of the central focus of that charter, which is actually made usually with the Attorney General of the state, is actually on the collections, the maintenance of those collections. So there's a very strong tie to the collections, even in the research component of the museums. And yeah, I did that for 18 years and then moved to Minnesota last summer.
Okay. Yes. So again, the sort of the format here, the sort of idea behind who we've invited, again, was that we have somebody from a smaller, more regional museum in a public university setting, somebody from a large national public museum, kind of the large national public museum in the U.S., and then somebody most of whose career has been was spent so far anyway at a large research a private museum. So very sort of different sectors within the museum world as a career. And what I'd like to do, as I chatted with y'all while Pete was finishing up, if you have questions, to let me know. If you'd like me to ask your question, I certainly can, but I don't need to. I can also just call on you in order. And so the first question came in from Karen Bauer. And Karen, if you're happy enough to ask your question, go ahead. Otherwise, I can do it for you as you wish.
Yeah, thank you all for giving those introductions. And I have a question for all of you. I was just wondering if you feel as if having your PhDs and your different fields helped you when it came to getting the positions that you have been able to get at different museums, and if you think that it would have been harder if you did not have your PhD.
You guys have to like just jump and go and
Okay,
tag team.
Curatorships at most large museums are essentially equivalent to faculty positions at universities, so PhDs are requirements. There are other positions where that is not necessarily the case. So at the Field Museum and at the American Museum, I know, for example, collections management positions did not require a PhD in the past, but the general trend is that they are being occupied by PhD level scientists to a greater and greater degree. So that's sort of my experience.
So, no, was your position, was a PhD required for your position? I presume it was.
Yeah, yeah. Like Pete said, I think large museums in the US at least, the curators are the equivalent of faculty members. And then the collection managers, who are actually the curators in my mind, because they are working, day to day with the collection, don't have to have, or the collections don't have to have a PhD. From what I know in London at the Natural History Museum, the curators do not need to have a PhD, or at least it was the case until recently. But yeah, for me, it was something that I couldn't have, I could have gone there without my PhD. I don't know, Laura, is that what?
Yeah, well, I don't remember how your position was advertised, Laura. Do you?
It was museum and collections manager, but they full out intended to hire a master's. They were looking for a master's student, but the PhD was helpful because it made me competitive. And so I think most of the top candidates had PhDs. And so they ultimately ended up choosing me, which was a PhD. So I'd say even though it wasn't required, it was extremely helpful. Most of my colleagues who have received collections management positions have all been PhDs. So it's really just a competitive market, and it seems to be where they're going. I do have to say another positive, and I don't know the rules specifically, but they formulated my position as an academic professional researcher, which is like a halfway point between faculty and staff. And so I'm technically considered faculty, but it's like untenured faculty. And where I'm going with this is that I am able to be a PI. And so having that PhD has been really helpful for PI status, and also getting some pretty big grants. So I know that's something that people are looking at when considering who they hire.
Cool. Okay. And Karen, did that answer your question? Is that what you're looking for? Great. Okay. Let's see. Our next question is from Evan T. Whiting. Evan, let's hear from you.
Yeah. So my question is, what was the best sort of preparation? This is for all of you, I guess. What was the best way to prepare for your current positions? Was it more training that you received in grad school, or beforehand, or a mixture of sort of all of the above, or postdoc, I guess?
I would say, having spent my my grad school career mostly at a natural history museum certainly was very helpful for getting a job as a curator in a natural history museum, because you get exposed to sort of the differences that exist between a museum and a university to some degree. So there's a different emphasis. At a museum you might not be TAing as much, but you would be doing certain types of, you might be helping with exhibit development, fundraising, and other things. So certainly being able to speak to that when you interview is certainly helpful. Because it is that's one of the key differences that you might run into. So being able to speak that language and knowing that what the general expectations are for the non-research part of the job, which, as I said, is more related to collections, but also exhibit development and public outreach, informal education type stuff. Those things are certainly helpful.
Yeah, for me, the most important thing I think was having a postdoc, having experience with research, because the main thing that the curators do at the Natural History Museum in DC is research, especially at the beginning. The tenure clock is very short; it's about 3.5 years. So I think they're looking for somebody who can hit the ground running. So for me, having had 5 years of postdoc and a bunch of publications under my belt, really helped me at least get into that, short list of people who were invited to interview.
Mine was a bit different. Research definitely helped, and I think it gave me the door. It opened the door, but it was my experience at museums prior that really helped. But what they were looking for with me was a jack of all trades, someone that could do everything, including being the face. And so I could, I am actually an introvert, but I really like talking with people and working with students. And so I've actually found that my interactions as a graduate student working with undergrads has been some of the most helpful, because those are my main employees here at the University Museum are my students. And so working with how to mentor them, how to formulate a research project. Basically, my entire background has come together to help with this position, except for financial. That's grant management and things like that. That's been a challenge. So.
And one question I have real quick before I'm going to jump in line here because I can. Laura, at Wyoming, are there faculty members who are also curators in the museum? Or okay, so it's not uncommon at universities. So some folks may not know this. It's not uncommon at university-based museums such as Wyoming, University of Michigan, Berkeley, University of Washington. I'm sure there are others that I'm Yale, where there are Florida. Evan's given us a gator there, where there are faculty who, although Florida is actually a little different. There are faculty whose appointments are both in a museum, and it's true of Minnesota also, whose appointments are in both an academic unit, a department, but also in the museum. And so the curators of paleontology or of mammalogy have in part a faculty line in a tenure home department, but also then have responsibilities in the museum as a separate institution or a separate organization within the university. And so that's kind of between the three of you, in a sense, we don't have somebody representing that kind of role, but it is a role that is common at university-based museums.
Right, but for example, in our museum, the curators can have adjunct positions at universities. So,
right, like George Washington or wherever.
Yeah, regional universities we can go and teach.
That's right, that's right.
No, but I think what David's talking about is more like my wife, who is a curator at the Bell Museum, but also a professor in the fisheries, wildlife, and conservation unit.
Biology, yeah,
So.
exactly. Let's see, Bree, you have a question.
Yeah, was there anything, like any aspects of your positions that you weren't expecting before you got started in them?
It's like where your boss goes, as you know.
I think one of the things that, and this didn't come right away, but with time, one of the things that happens particularly in some of the bigger non-governmental institutions is that they're, as nonprofit organizations that depend on A, visitorship, and B, on, endowment dollars. When there's an economic downturn, let's say the 2001 market crash or the 2008 crash or the current pandemic crash, you get these huge downswings financially that, you know, so you go from, they're a little bit like boom and bust cycles where, you know, when the economy's going well, people are donating to the museum, the endowment's growing, there's money for all this stuff. And then, you know, suddenly something happens and, you know, it's belt tightening and layoffs and furloughs and all this stuff. So that was something that sort of instability was something that I, you know, nobody told me about as a grad student. And I got to experience as a department chair. So yeah, that part of it was sort of surprising. I think if you're tied to a government entity, there's probably you know, you feel some of that up and down, but it's probably buffered somewhat.
Laura, Nona, what about you?
For me, it was kind of the day-to-day operations. And so like I schedule students every semester to work in the museum. I answered so many admin emails about the museum. I probably spend half my day on emails alone. So I didn't expect, you know, as a manager of a museum, it's like a manager of a store, I didn't expect to be doing a lot of these. Well, I knew I'd be doing them. I just didn't know what involved with these management roles. And so that came as a bit of a surprise to me on how much time it would take. And then I guess something else that kind of surprised me was how little I actually interact with the fossils. I work a lot with students, and I have a lot of student projects, and I have a lot of student exhibits, but my hands-on work with them or of the actual like, exhibits and fossils is pretty small. And so that was a surprise. I mean, it's the way it is, but I have a lot of really good students who work with it. And, you know, and the whole point about my position is working with students to give them the tools to go out and have museum experience. So it's all worth it. But I found it a little surprising on my end.
Yeah, and in my position, so I think there's a stool with 3 legs, and 1 leg is research, 1 is outreach, and 1 is collections work. So I kind of knew that in going into to interviewing for this position, that these would be the main things that I would be doing. But I didn't really know, especially on the curation side, how it was going to go. Outreach, yes, you know, something about, you know, talking to the public. But then there's also developing exhibits in time, probably. Research, very comfortable with that. Collections, hardly knew anything going in. So I think one unexpected thing is the amount of work that goes into the collection, especially if it's a large national collection, like the one I'm working with, which is the National Gem and Mineral Collection, where there are more than 400,000 specimens, and 2 collection managers and 3 curators working on that collection alone. And then the way the collection grows is mainly through purchases. This is a mineral collection and gem collection, mainly through purchases and donations. So one aspect of the job is actually talking to donors and schmoozing, going to the mineral show in Tucson, which is the biggest gem and mineral show on the planet, I think. And you know, buying specimens for tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Wow. Huh. And no, does the Smithsonian loan mineral specimens to researchers for various purposes, sort of like fossil collections will do?
Oh yeah, totally. And the collections are actually searchable online, so you can go ahead and look for wherever you want in your research, and then you submit a request for a loan. And you have to put together a short proposal type thing where the curator or one of the curators of the collection you're interested in will assess the viability of your scientific project or purpose. And then we'll also decide if the amount you're asking for is realistic. So if you're doing some kind of nano to micro experiment and you're asking for, you know, a kilogram of whatever, then we're there to sort of vet that process.
Okay. Let's see. Our next question, Shanti. Do you want to ask it, or I can read your question either way?
Hi. Yeah, my question, I guess you guys have already touched on this a little bit, but I was kind of curious about like job security in the museum field. I know you were talking about the boom and bust cycle, but specifically I was kind of curious about like tenure, if there's tenure for everyone or kind of if there's anything equivalent to that. And then also like salaries. I don't really know much about, you know, what kind of salaries there are compared to academia and things like that.
Well, so tenure is actually fairly rare in the museum world. The only museums I'm aware of that actually have a tenure hiring, a sort of a indefinite tenure the way universities do, like the U of M would be the American Museum and the Smithsonian. And then the Field Museum had it until recently, and then switched to a sort of renewable contract for new hires for in the most recent iteration. In general, other museums will have the ability to be promoted. So you can go, for example, the Denver Museum of Natural History or Natural Sciences, or the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. They have ranks of curators, and you can be promoted the same way you can, for example, at the Field Museum or the American Museum, but you don't get indefinite tenure with it. That being said, it's extremely rare to see someone get fired for cause. So it's pretty rare. Occasionally, I can think of one instance where curators were laid off, and this was in LA many years ago in response to financial hardship. Yeah, for most museums around the country, and there's quite a few of them, you know, every major city will have a reasonably sized natural history museum, but outside of the American Museum and the Smithsonian, at this point, I don't think anyone actually has a tenure system corresponding to the university system.
Yeah, and at the Smithsonian, it's kind of a quasi tenure. So all the curators go through a review cycle, depending on how advanced you are. So in the beginning, it's 3.5 years, and then every 5 years for a couple of cycles, and then every 7 years. And at each step, well, actually the first step is the most critical, because they can, if you do not pass the tenure process, so that first review is actually equivalent to tenure, they can let you go, but afterwards it would have to be disciplinary, or because working for the government, I don't think you can get laid off that easily. So in a sense, I think the job security is pretty good, and at the Smithsonian, they're actually doing away with the first cycle right now. If you want to become a curator at the Smithsonian, you'll be on a 1-year probation, and then you'll start going through these review cycles. But you still have to perform and you know, check all the boxes. And as for salary, I think it's you can compare it to universities, or maybe lower. I don't know exactly.
It depends what universities you're comparing to.
Right, exactly.
Universities have there are so many more universities than museums that, you know, the range is bigger. Yeah, it's in general, I would say if you're comparing to top-ranked universities like Ivies and so on, museum salaries are going to be a little bit lower. If you're looking at state schools and, you know, in the R1 categories, they're fairly comparable salaries overall. So for curatorial positions, if you're coming in at other positions, then even technical positions in museums tend to be fairly low pay, is my impression.
And
Yeah.
Laura, your position's without permanent job security. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. So to start with, the museum is, well, it's endowment supported now, but in 2008 there was a big economic downturn, and that's when they actually threatened to close the museum. But we had a director, Brent Breithaupt. I don't know if you knew him, but he was fired.
Now of the BLM.
Now at the BLM, indeed. So, so that job security, that was a case where there was not job security because it was funded through the state at the time. Since then, the vulnerability has been recognized, and several endowments have been put in place for this museum behind me. And so we have money to pay me, but it comes out of several different pots. And that being said, I could be let go in a year. Also being said, though, it's no longer up to the state; it's up to my supervisors, and it's not. I mean, as long as I do the job well, it's fine. But it's no longer like an issue where the dean of arts and science can come down and say we have to cut this position, because we have endowments. We have some stability with that. But I still do an annual review. And then again, I'm an academic professional researcher, which is considered non-tenured, but but you can go on extended term track. And so you can get reviewed every three-ish years. So collections managers, though, at the University of Wyoming generally get paid about the same as a postdoc, between a graduate student and a postdoc, so pretty low. My personal salary is somewhere between a postdoc and an entering faculty member, tenure track faculty member. So it's not high at all. It's definitely on the lower end, but I kind of look at it as a convenience fee, or it's a fee for not having to publish. So or I also look at it as a fee for living in the most wonderful place in the world. So, so it comes at some costs, but I knew that coming in, that the salary was a lot lower. And I have room for advancement as well, but it's a really different track, and it's in some ways it's more equatable to soft money than hard money.
Let me just add that if you have a family and come to DC, you need your partner to have a job too.
There's cost of living issues. Yeah, that salary would be less practical if Laura were a collections manager at the Smithsonian, probably. So Laura, your position is different in a sense also, as you describe it, then, that the fact that your money comes from an endowed source it would not be typical of collections managers at university museums, I think, generally.
Well, and that's because
who are your supervisors? Is it the curators of various collections?
I'll be honest, it's quite fluid and undefined, and part of that is just because we have such a small department, and there's been a little bit of mix-up. But in the past, the museum was completely separate from the collections and the department. Thanks to Brent Breithaupt. But they put them back together. But there's been a couple, long story short, my direct supervisor is the department head. It's convenient now because the department head is also the curator. But without a doubt, I also answer to our curators. So if they're unhappy, then my performance goes down. But it's the chain of command is directly to my department head. Not the curator.
You don't have to answer to Jay Littlegraven, though, do you? I mean,
oh, God, no.
Is Mark the department chair now?
He is, yeah.
Oh my. So and I mean, I think there's one point to make also about your position in general. The category of your position at museums is there. I mean, generally speaking, no employer wants to hire people they expect to turn over. And in a position like yours, which is a really important role in the management of a natural history collection, there is a goal to have that be a long-term position, so there's institutional memory. You don't want that churning year over year over year, because that becomes an impediment to people's research programs, to growing the collection and so forth. So, in a sense, there is, and this is true in many positions, though not all, there is an inertia of job security, in the sense that as long as you are doing what's expected and the personalities are meshing and so forth, the institution wants you to stay there, right? So it's not like you're not walking around on tenterhooks all the time. So
No,
let's see.
no, but I was going to say, but I am always aware that
Right.
I can be cut. I'm always
Right.
aware,
Right.
but I'm not.
But this is actually a key point where the charters of museums come in, because and having gone through 2 cycles of sort of economic downturns during at a museum, curators were at the time protected by their tenure clauses in their contracts, but at some point it came down to, well, you can't just get rid of all the collections management, because that is the people who do the day-to-day managing of the collections, handling the loans, processing outgoing loans, incoming loans, registering everything, accessioning everything that's brought in, so on and so forth. And ultimately, the charter of the museum is based on maintaining the collection, not maintaining any given number of positions or research per se. And that actually led ultimately, for example, to some reorganization at the field museum, so that collections management responsibility for collections is now split between curators and collection managers. Decisions need to be countersigned by both, at the end of the day, the Attorney General of Illinois or New York or wherever has to be able to say, yes, this institution is living up to its fiduciary responsibilities vis-a-vis maintaining this collection. And so, collections management has, at some of these bigger museums in the past been overlooked, but it is a very key and perhaps the most key operation in the building.
Right. That's
when
really
push
good
comes
point.
to shove. So.
Right. Let's see. I'm going to say this right. Carrie Myron, have I got that right? You're next up on our list.
That's perfect. Yeah, I have a question about.
We can't quite hear you.
Can you hear me now?
A little better.
Okay. Yeah, I had a question about research, and if research in a museum is harder to come by or harder to work on versus at a university or college because of access to resources or other differences between working in a university.
Okay, so just to make sure I could hear it, she asked about whether or not research work at a museum, in a museum setting, is harder than in a university setting for access to resources and support and so forth. And I think each of you could kind of talk about that and from different perspectives. That's a really great question.
Yeah, so at the Smithsonian, we have really good infrastructure for research. Our department, which is one of 7, is very well equipped for mineralogy, petrology, meteoritics, so geobiology. I would say, it's similar to university setting. I don't find it harder to do research, and especially in DC, where there are many institutions around the Smithsonian you can collaborate with and use their instruments. But also going to other departments and other museums in the Smithsonian. So I think the Smithsonian is kind of unique that way. It's a big research institution in part, so I don't find it at all difficult to do research.
Well, and no, I would add that, from the paleontology perspective, really in all components of paleo, vertebrate paleontology, invertebrate micropaleontology, paleobotany, there are international leaders at the Smithsonian who are very, very important figures in research in paleontology.
Right.
There.
I think the one impediment, if you're starting as a new curator, is the startup. is about 10% of what a startup at a university is. So yeah, that first grant is very small, but there are other advantages, like having instruments in-house that you don't have to pay for, with contract services, service contracts, and also the opportunity to apply for internal money, smaller grants, but more accessible than, for example, NSF or NASA grants.
Laura, do you have do you have much of a research footprint of your own, or is your involvement in research more in a support role with the other working in the club and so forth?
Yeah, so I am, in my job description, I am actually 90% research, which is pretty crazy. But I do very, very little personal research. It's all considered collaborative research, which is support research. In my role, I am encouraged to do personal research, but I do not have to do personal research. And that is something that I wanted, and I sought as a job description. Because I'm affiliated with the University of Wyoming, it's quite easy to do research because we have all the journal articles, we have access to labs. Funding the research is a little bit tricky, but it's doable. So it's easy to do research here, and it's encouraged to do research, and I do a lot of undergraduate research. But I do have to say that my personal research has taken a much lower priority. And as much as I would love to do more, it really, it's when I have time, and I almost rarely have time. So,
Pete, what is your view? You're kind of coming into the university studying, obviously lots of time spent with folks from this environment, but what was your view of your research at the Field Museum?
Well, I mean, research is, at least at bigger bigger museums, is kind of the key component of your hiring contract. And it's kind of like Nono said, you don't get a big startup. I think, mine was 70,000 or something, but you also don't have to pay for a lot of things. So for example, field vehicles were just there. You just used them. There was no charge other than the gas. Preparation of fossils, there were labs and people doing that. You didn't pay for that. So it's just a different way of calculating it. So if you're doing the kind of research that is aligned with the museum mission, so it's essentially collections-based work, I would say research is actually very easy at a museum. If you try to kind of do something very different, for which the resources aren't in-house, perhaps not tied as strongly to collections, it gets more complicated. But you do have a lot of research freedoms, and one thing, if you're not tied to an academic calendar, is you can do a lot more field work. So if your colleagues in Argentina want to do field work in February, you can go. You don't have to say, well, I'm teaching 1001 or something. So you do have a lot of flexibility in that way, which is, if you're doing a fieldwork program, is an important asset to have. So I would actually say, again, it's tied to exactly the nature of your research, but museums can be very, good places for research. Are you guys hearing? Sorry, they're drilling upstairs, so I may have to move.
Okay.
They're installing some shelving upstairs. So, but yeah, in general, I would say actually, I'm obviously new at the University of Minnesota, so I haven't kind of found my stride yet. But I would say over the last year, I found it more difficult to get research done than in the past. Where
more demands on your time.
More demands and more structured time. I don't have the same travel.
Pete, for the moment, why don't you mute until you're answering a question? Let's see, Emily Briggs, you are next.
All right, so my question was about, I know that a lot of institutions are offering museum study masters or undergraduate certificates that are designed specifically for getting more museum experience. And so I don't know how involved you are with the hiring process, but if somebody like me were to come in without a museum certificate or a museum master's or something like that, that my PhD is really, you know, topic specific. So for me, it'd be archaeology. Would that comparatively put me at a disadvantage now that we're seeing all of these museum degrees and museum programs gaining more popularity? Just curious about how that's affecting your eligibility in the hiring market.
Yeah, so I've been on a hiring committee last year, and I don't think any, I mean, some people had experience with museums and collections and working with samples, but I don't think any of them were at an advantage or disadvantage. However, if you had come with a degree in museum studies, I think you could have gained some advantage. But you also have to sort of check all the other boxes, which are to show independence in research, potential for productivity, and so on. But I would say that if you want to get a job in a museum, then a master's related to museum studies would be advantageous. Although the caveat here is that I don't think there are many jobs in the museum world, especially at big research institutions, because there aren't many.
Yeah, I would say from my personal experience. Sorry, go ahead. I would say from my experience, the kind of jobs that people got with a master's in museum studies was generally, for example, a couple of people I worked with in exhibits who were exhibit developers came in with a certificate or a master's in museum studies. If you're looking for a research-based curatorial position, you're going to need a PhD in a relevant field. So I would say the museum certificate, if you can get it as part of another degree, certainly gives you a leg up. And I think one of the advantages is you know how to speak the language, you know the vernacular, you know some of the concerns. But at least in my experience, people who are getting a master's in museum studies are looking for a technical level position, but not a research type position, more sort of exhibit development or maybe some aspect of collection management, or we had a number of people, yeah, we had a number of people in, I think, the archaeology and anthropology conservation labs that had backgrounds where they had maybe a fine arts background that they combined with a museum master's degree to do that, which is a very technical type of position, but it's not a research position.
Laura, what were you going to add?
So I'll be honest, my position would probably be very well suited to somebody with a museum studies degree because it is so inclusive. You know, I write the strategic plans, I write the proposals, but I have to tell you, I have zero professional or academic training in museum studies. All of mine was experience. And so I think it might just show you that, at least in my position, there was more emphasis put on my research, my knowledge of research, not specifically what I did, but the fact that I was familiar with the research process and what it took, and my experience. And so I think it would give you a leg up, but I wouldn't put all your eggs in that basket. I found with my position and then also looking at other positions and my peers getting positions, they are much, much more interested in the experience you have. And so, and as part of our museum studies program here at UW, we have like 3 required internships at 3 different types of museums. And so that's actually probably the best benefit of your museum studies, is that it will get you into collections, doing hands-on stuff, as well as working with different databases. And so, again, I like the museum studies and certificates, but I would actually think that the experience you gain from them would probably give you a bigger leg up, and you might not need to do the actual certificate to get that experience.
Cool, great, thank you. Let's see, Natalie, you've got a question for Laura and a question for all that I think is a really good one. So
yeah, so first, Laura, I was wondering if you could speak to how you found your position and what types of, how you approached the job search, and if you were doing anything, you know, at the tail end of your PhD at Minnesota to get additional experience. And then for all, are there useful professional museum organizations that you are affiliated with and that you found useful, or other email listservs that you can recommend?
Yeah. I don't think you're going to be happy with my answer. How I found my position, I did my undergrad here at the University of Wyoming. And so I maintained a really good relationship with the curator of the vertebrate collections in the museum. And so I knew from just word of mouth that the position was coming up, and I knew a lot of the people in the department. And so as much as I don't like to say it, word of mouth and who you know was really key in my, at least my application process. I still had to go through the full application process. I was up against some very good competitors for the position. So that, I mean, a lot of it is who you know for these smaller positions, and timing. The timing worked out really well. In terms of what I did to help myself, so I applied for the position and I did my my interview about 2 weeks before I defended my PhD at Minnesota. And I actually found out like 2 days before defending that I got the position. So it was good times. But again, having the familiarity with research and having advised several students was really helpful in terms of getting the position, and then just kind of this broad approach that I could put a lot of tools in my toolbox was really helpful. So, and then the only one that I have for you is the Spinach Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections. They have been a really good resource that I've seen. iDigBio has been amazing. And then I've actually gotten some of my best experience going to some iDigBio seminars and workshops. And from those workshops that I did, I've actually created some really important connections, and that's really helped me with digitizing. So, which is one of my big pushes with me, is digitizing our collections. And so they take students, and so I think, again, just who you know and getting familiar with these people would probably be really advantageous.
Thanks.
Pete and Nona, do y'all have recommendations for museum organizations or listservs?
Maybe Pete
Yeah,
can go because he
so,
has more experience.
The big organization that covers museums as a whole, and this includes art museums and other types of museums as well as natural history museums, is the AAM, the American Alliance of Museums. They provide museum accreditation. They have listservs on all manner of a lot of outreach stuff, but also collections related stuff. And I think there are some pages dedicated to jobs in there. More specifically for natural history museums, yeah, Spinach or SPNHC, as Laura was saying, is sort of the big international umbrella organization that has, I think they're annual or biannual meetings, I forget, around the world, but they're fairly large, attended by several hundred people. And of course, just looking at those listservs are good ways to do it. And then depending on your particular interest or job skills, there are smaller organizations. So one of the sort of categories of jobs in vertebrate paleontology, rather unique to vertebrate paleontology, are preparators, people who actually clean matrix off fossils, stabilize them, build the cradles that, you know, they go into to be safely in the collections. And that, so they have a small organization of their own that, you know, and I think equivalent ones exist in the anthropology, archaeology worlds and so on. So figuring out what those organizations are is a good first step for these more technical, but not necessarily research-centric positions. But yeah, I think spinach is sort of a large catch-all one for everyone. I know anthropology has their own thing, and I don't know about some of the scientific societies. The Society for Vertebrate Paleontology actually has a session for vertebrate preparators and collection managers, and sort of a dedicated subpart of that committee or of that body is dedicated to that. I don't know, for example, if any of the mineralogical societies do that. No.
Well, on the mineral side, there is the Society of Mineral Museum Professionals, or SMMP, which is an international organization, which is a good resource. But I don't think that the societies like, I guess,
MSA.
Yeah, MSA or others, they may have a small museum component, but I don't think they have a big footprint for that.
Awesome, great. Let's see, next up is Fernando.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts. So it was, I guess, answering a previous question. I was wondering, how do you compare your experience in terms of getting funding for research, such as applying for government funding or getting internal funding or private funding? I know that you get 10%. I mean, it's less the funding that you get as a startup, but I don't know if there are any other difference that you can compare to academia. Not only funded, but also opportunities to get students that you may want to collaborate with to do thesis or such as stuff like that. Like, how do you compare that with academia?
Yeah, so at the Smithsonian, you cannot have students. You can have grad fellows that come in for a few months maybe, but you can't have a PhD or a master student full-time yet. I'm actually on a committee, and we're trying to build relationships, official relationships with the universities around the Smithsonian. So there can be some programs dedicated to sending students to the Smithsonian from different fields. But in terms of getting money for research, I think, at least for me, it's a much more relaxed situation. I don't feel pressure to apply for funding all the time. I can apply whenever I have a need. There are internal grants to the Smithsonian that I can apply to, which are not as competitive as for example, NSF grants. But I can also decide, I mean, if I want to get a major grant to go for NASA or NSF or similar societies. So it depends. I mean, you could, in my setting, you could go for big money all the time, or you could not. You could sustain yourself from small pots. Hope that helps a little.
Thanks.
And Pete, you all certainly would have been applying to NSF grants and probably others. Was there internal money at the Field Museum also, or not really?
Yes. So there were reasonably good, well, depending on the sort of economic sort of conjuncture of society as a whole, but we did have a number of endowment funds, including ones for postdocs. So one of the things that was very nice at the Field Museum was it was relatively easy to bring in a postdoc for a couple of years. So for example, in the department I was in, we had a endowed postdoc position that was permanently filled for someone working with one of the curators. You could also, and I did this a couple of times, was actually get postdocs in with funding through major exhibits. So if you're building like a major exhibit, 5, 7, 8,000 square feet, it would, you know, besides you as the curator supervising the science component, you'd actually need someone to do certain things, like let's say scan fossils, and so you could get postdoc funding that way, and then a postdoc would be someone who'd work 50% of the time of their time would be dedicated to exhibit related activities, but then they would have the rest of the time for their research. So there were those kinds of pots of money, and yeah, just as the Smithsonian, we'd have smaller pots of money available for research, so seed funding, you know, $10, $15, $25,000 on a fairly regular basis. And then with students, well, apart from the American Museum, which actually has a graduate school in it, no museum is a degree granting institution. So when you have students at university or at museums, it's through a university affiliation. So I used to be adjunct at University of Chicago. So the graduate students I supervised, and they would be at the museum. They'd have their offices next door to mine. But their degree granting institution and their degree requirements were filled through the University of Chicago. So if you have those types of collaborations, you can have students. But yeah, with the exception of the Gilder School at the American Museum, no museum has a degree granting sort of branch, at least natural history wise.
Laura, do you have anything you want to add on this?
Just a little bit. I'm expected to, like, if I want to do research, I have to find my own funds for it. And so I've been part of several NSF grants. They're small things, but if it's like a big project. But the only main difference I want to add is I do a lot of applying for collections related grants. So for upkeep of collections, expanding collections, digitizing collections. And I actually have a graduate student. So as a non-tenured, I can have graduate students, but I have to co-advise. And so, so I do have a graduate student, but they are funded off of a IMLS, which is an Institute of Museum and Library Services grant. And that's purely to digitize our collection. But it's a different way to get students and to fund students. So it's not a typical way that you would expect.
Cool. Great, thank you. Let's see. Kirsten, I believe you are next up in line.
Awesome. My question was that once you start going down the museum kind of path, how kind of stuck do you feel there? Like, do you think you can make the transition into university teaching? I know Pete just did, so he might have something to say about that. But yeah, is there kind of any flexibility, or once you kind of go down that path, do you feel like you're probably going to stay there?
Pete, you show that the probability is 1.0 that you can make the transition. So,
yeah, it's a binary character.
That's right.
Well, it's funny you should ask, Kirsten, because after 18 years at the Field Museum, I was pretty much figuring I was a lifer until my wife decided that we were moving. So. But yes, you can make the transition. One of the things that you know, certainly helped me was that I had this adjunct connection to not only the University of Chicago but also Northwestern. So I used to actually do some teaching both at the U of C and at Northwestern, which is a nice extra income stream. But kind of got me used to that, at least thinking about teaching and thinking about my research in the context of teaching in a way. So it wasn't a complete sort of abrupt change. I'd had some experience. So I think it's possible. I know people who have moved in either direction, who've gone from the university world to the museum world or vice versa. It's not that infrequent to see that happening. I think one of the things, and this is probably more a function of just embedding yourself in an institution research-wise, that's the hard part. I don't think necessarily whether it's university or a museum and going from one to the other is a challenge. It's more that you sort of build up a set of resources and labs and collaborators in one place, and then, you know, changing that environment is what's the actual challenge, not necessarily switching sort of the type of institution.
And Pete, I think in some regards, I think you're, as far as I can, I'm not racking my brain entirely, but I would think in some regards you may be the exception that proves the rule. Not that your answer was there as a rule, but I think it's less common to go from a museum setting to a standalone academic department with that separated from a museum than it is to go in either direction from a museum, a university affiliated museum to a private museum or a national museum, or vice versa, because you're still moving into a space where there is that museum bit. Making the transition directly from an academic unit to a museum or from a museum to an academic unit, I think is less common probably.
Yeah, I'm now I have to actually think of people who've done it.
Yeah.
So.
Nobody comes immediately to mind, right?
Well, I mean, Cedar
Chiara
moved
Santelli.
from, yeah.
Chiara Santelli. That's a great point. That's a great point.
Yeah, Cedar moved from NICOM teaching human anatomy to the
Yep.
Burke Museum. So that was one. Carano kind of did that. He was teaching human anatomy, wasn't he? They moved to the.
I forget.
Smithsonian.
I forget.
Anjali moved from.
Yep.
UCL to.
Yep.
The Natural History
Yes.
Museum.
Yeah. University College London to the Natural History Museum in London. That's right. That's right.
So I guess, yeah, there's more movement towards museums. Yeah.
Perhaps so. That's a great question, though. That's a good question. Let's see. We got about 15 minutes. There's a couple more questions. So I think it'll work out just right, I think. Harrison, I think you've got a question about something we've not really talked about much at all that I think would be great to bring up.
Sure. Yeah. So I was interested in how often you were involved in designing exhibits and what that experience is like.
Laura, you want to go first?
Oh boy. So I don't know if you can see, this is basically we're about 1/3 finished at my museum. And so we have quite a few exhibits to work on and design. I do not love designing exhibits, it turns out. Exhibits are very difficult to me to not make it look like a science fair project or a craft fair project. It's really important to me that you have a very professional, good-looking exhibit. And that's where I like to let the professionals who know how to do that do it. And so I worked with a lot of students to put together temporary exhibits, but actual permanent exhibits, I will work with a exhibit firm. And there's a lot of reasons for doing that, but they are the experts in working in exhibits. So I guess my 2 cents is that exhibits are surprisingly hard, even though there's very few text, but the materials and the professional level is actually quite hard to achieve, in my opinion. But I'm a one-person house. I do everything on my own. I don't have people that are dedicated just to exhibits. And so, again, that's why I actually contract out and work with people who do.
So now I'm going to jump to Nono next, only because I know Pete has a lot of experience with this at the Field Museum. Nono, have you been involved in exhibit development yet in your time at the Smithsonian?
No, not yet. I've cleaned an exhibit. So we actually closed the whole mineral and gem hall for 1 week in February, just before the corona hit. And everybody from our department, from the curators to collection managers to everybody, were out there dusting off the specimens and scrubbing and cleaning. So that was nice. I really liked that. But indeed, we do work with an exhibit division at the Smithsonian when designing exhibits. And I might be involved in something small in the next few years, but the big geology hall, I think will have it'll be another 10 years, I think, before it gets a revamp. So in a way, I've heard that it's a totally draining experience to do a big exhibit. But then people have told me that it's one of the best things I've ever done, because you get to create something that the public will benefit from, even if it takes 5 years of your life. But then you reap the rewards for many years after.
Right. So Pete, what do you think, Pete? Best thing ever, or completely draining, or both?
Both. I mean, I've done probably about a dozen exhibits, from kind of the small scale temporary to permanent, over 18 years. So I would say, especially if you do paleontology, and especially if you do dinosaurs, you end up doing a lot more exhibits than the average museum curator, because it is a funding source, basically. It is the cash cow of a freestanding natural history museum. It can be a lot of work, but it can also be really fun to kind of put your creative imprint on something that will be seen by a million people. So sometimes if you're doing really big exhibits, or if you're doing multiple at a time. So right before I left the Field Museum, we were doing three major exhibit initiatives. Total coverage probably 30,000 square feet. So that was a lot of being pulled in different directions. But it can be really fun. You work if you have a dedicated in-house exhibit team, and bigger museums tend to do so. You get to work with some really creative people who have a really neat sort of visual aesthetic that you can kind of contribute the science side. They can contribute sort of the aesthetic interpretive side, and you can actually work together to generate something that the final product is so much cooler than whatever you had in your mind when you started, that it can be a very rewarding experience. So one of the most fun things I've done at the Field Museum was actually, I was lead curator on an exhibit called Antarctic Dinosaurs. It's a traveling exhibit. It's currently stuck at the Discovery Place in Charlotte, North Carolina. But this was sort of taking my research and fieldwork in Antarctica and then putting it into a bigger context, arranging loans of specimens from other places, Kansas, Argentina, but then also getting this collection of historic materials from the Robert Falcon Scott expeditions and the Terra Nova expeditions, and from Christchurch in New Zealand, and bringing all these things together, building dioramas, kind of coming up with a cool lighting scheme, which is, for example, we had everything that's present day Antarctica be brightly lit like daylight, because when you're there, it's 24 hours daylight when you're working, and then make everything in the past kind of twilight, aurora australis, and kind of just work with these really neat concepts of trying to have this subliminal effect to teach people that you're actually dealing with different seasons. So you might not see the snow and the ice, but it is actually winter darkness, even in the Mesozoic. So kind of really fun set of things to do. It can be overwhelming. I know, for example, the major overhaul of the Smithsonian's Paleo Halls had my colleague Matt Carano looking pretty dog-eared at the end of it. But I think it's something, if it's done right and done well, and you feel like you've gotten your message across, you also know that, literally millions of people are going to see this. So it's really going to have an impact. So it can be a lot of fun. Be very satisfying. And sometimes, the product isn't as great. It's like everything else in life. Sometimes you wish you'd done something a little differently at the end of it, but.
Cool. Okay. We got a couple more I think we can get in, and it'll work out just right. So Nora, you're the next in line.
Hey, first of all, thank you for taking the time out of your schedules to come talk to us. My question is, what is the thing about working at a museum that you find the most rewarding, that you wouldn't necessarily get to do as much of if you were a research professor at a university?
I'm going to call on one of you if you don't respond.
I'll take the bait.
Oh no, I still want to think.
Well, it's again, it's if you do the kind of research that museums are specially equipped to do, let's say heavily specimen-based research, collections-based research, that's the real advantage of being there. You have the material at hand. You get to make decisions about destructive sampling. For example, if you want to do histology, or my former colleague Philip Heck, who works on meteoritics, published a paper a few months ago in PNAS on the oldest sort of calibrated material in pre-solar grains, so 5.7 billion year old material, came out of the Murchison meteorite, which he has a couple of 100 kilograms of in the collection. And you can make that decision. I'm going to go and look for pre-solar grains in Murchison. So if you want to do the really sort of collections focused research, you certainly have an advantage if you are working in a natural history museum.
Laura, what were you going to say?
Yeah, so it's a tough question. I guess for me, the most rewarding part is the variety and the people I get to work with. Every day is so different. Again, I wear a lot of hats, but the biggest part is interacting with people. And so, you know, I'm emailing people, I work with students, I work with visitors, I work with researchers, I work with colleagues and professors at the university, within the department. I work really closely with the library here on campus. And so it's a whole bunch of wheels that are just constantly spinning. But I really like that I have so many different things in the pan, and then it all comes together. And every day is again just so different. And I have the ability to be like, well, today I don't really want to work on collections, so I'm going to go work on something else. And I like that ability to kind of switch things up depending on where I am, you know, mental health wise that day, or socially, or just what has to be done. Again, emails are a monster and I hate them, but so I can't always do what I want, but I would have to say the people.
You know, Laura, that to me is at least at an institution like Minnesota, of the scale of Minnesota and a department this size, to me, what you're describing also is what, you know, life in a large academic unit is like also, in as much as you have that ability to sort of set your own schedule and decide what you're doing day to day within the confines of larger, you know, work goals that you have to meet on a longer time scale. And so for me personally, what you're saying sounds, you know, very much along the lines of what I like about my job, is that ability to make those decisions and the people you interact with and so forth. So.
Well, and I mean, I would also say though, like a collections manager might have a little bit different. I'm just lucky, and mine's such a unique place, but.
Right.
Yeah.
No, how about you?
Well, for me, the most rewarding thing is being at the Smithsonian. I mean, are you kidding me? It's an amazing place to be among such great specimens every day, all day. It's just mind-blowing. So every day when I step into the museum, I'm grateful for this opportunity. And like Laura said, that I can do whatever I want, and I don't have a boss necessarily, and I can decide to work, you know, depending on my mood or what is needed on whatever I want. So in short, that's my
right. Well, and I mean the thing about the Smithsonian is, you know, it's not just the Natural History Museum. There's whatever there is, 15 museums down the mall, and it's one of the singular greatest public spaces in the world. It's
That's
really
right.
It's a shocking collection of museums and materials and exhibits, and yeah, that's
yeah.
very
So
cool.
that's why in a past life, when I used to go to work, I would make a point to get off the metro station that gets you directly on the mall rather than some other place, which is a bit shorter, and you know, you just walk through DC. But I just, you know, pop up on the mall, and I see all the great Smithsonian buildings and the place I'm in. So.
So I think we have time to sneak in just one more from the list. Evan has another question he'd like to ask, kind of about how you get there.
Yeah, Thanks again. Sorry, we're kind of butting right up against the ending time here. But basically, my question is sort of along the lines of, how many publications or other things, I guess, other sort of reports or something, depending on, I guess, your specific goal, do you really need in order to be competitive for these different types of museum jobs and a different types of museums? So I guess this is for all of you.
Okay, I'll go.
Okay.
So in order to get the job, I mean, there's a variety of backgrounds. Some people come in with a lot of publications, some, not so many. So I don't know if there's, depending on what other things you've done. But once you're there, I personally have to, so in my plan, I have to produce 3 papers a year. So when they wanted me to hit the ground running, I was going kind of on the same pace. I've definitely kind of expanded a little bit since, but it's pretty research intensive in terms of where I am. So I don't know if that answers your question or if you're looking for something else.
So for me, it's a very different position than no-nos, where research is not a big component of it. My advice, and something that I think helped me along the way, is to put as many tools in your toolbox as you can. I think my position is basically 2 full-time positions that they combined into 1 full-time position, and then paid me less than either one of them. And I'm oh, there's a cat. And I'm the only reason I'm bringing that up is I knew what I was getting into, but I think that's going to be a trend in the future, is that there's more and more consolidation. And so I think you're going to be expected to do outreach and collections management, or teaching and be the museum director. So I think putting more tools in your toolbox, GIS, isotope analysis, display development, field work is actually surprisingly hard to come by some people. So just be pretty variable. But I will say that, again, I got my position because I had a PhD and I had a really strong handle on research, and I knew people and I was in a good place. And so, put yourself out there, go to meetings, take internships, go to workshops, and field trips. Like paleo field trips is a really great way to interact with people. So that's my recommendation.
Well, Laura, I just want to amplify or state again, kind of, you said it here and you said it earlier in another question, 2 things that you're saying that I think are really important for the students to hear. And one is the value of networking. Like you sort of said, oh, well, it's good, I knew people, but that's an important part of professional advancement in any context.
Yeah.
And the other that I think is really important for the students to really take on is the fact that your research experience doing your master's degree or your PhD is not does not lead to a single path into academia. It provides you with a skill set or a range of skill set, as you're suggesting, that open up other opportunities that you might not have thought about yet. And I think that's a really important message for students to hear from you.
Oh yeah, and I'm glad you bring it up, David, because that's something I wanted to touch on. Because nobody in grad school told me, you're just one of 10 who will get a job in academia. I was under the impression that, oh, you're a grad student, you just naturally go through the chain of becoming a postdoc and then getting a job as a faculty member. But as that was constricting as the years were passing, and I was kind of advancing through my postdocs, I realized that I should have started earlier thinking about all these other pathways and potential opportunities. So my advice to you is, keep your options open, do what you're doing, try to broaden out, and yeah, be prepared for surprises. Hey, Josh.
Like Josh.
be ready to go where you hadn't thought. Like, I'm at a museum. I didn't think I'd be at a museum, but it's a great job, and I'm not thinking of transitioning right now to a faculty position at all.
That's great. Pete, anything you want to add on this before we wrap up?
Yeah, so if you are applying for a curatorial position, so a research position at a major museum, they are rare. They are unicorns. I mean, they don't come up very often. People sit in those positions for 20 or 30 years. So when they come up, they're extremely desirable for people who do a certain kind of research, and they're going to be very competitive. So you want to be publishing a fair amount. And you also want to, if you apply for a museum job, you want to sort of think about things. Almost everyone who's sending out a job application has a teaching statement or teaching philosophy statement. If you're applying for a museum job, remember to have a collection statement. A lot of people forget, but that is an important part of the job. Major museums, at least in the United States, are want to build collections, so have ideas for fieldwork or other ways of building collections. That's a key component that'll give you a leg up.
And know about the collection at the institution where you're applying to.
You know,
you want to do your, if you're applying to a museum, do your research on what they do, what their collection's like, how you could augment their collection, not just collections generally.
How it would fit into your research ideas and so on. So those are important things, but you know, and then you know, the number of publications, obviously the more you have, the better. It's also going to depend on how open the search is. So for most searches, a lot of museums tend to want to hire people at the low end, so sort of you know, assistant level. Sometimes they open it up wider though. So my old position just got filled by someone who was a full professor in Peking. So sometimes they'll do that.
Who is that?
Jingmei O'Connor. So.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. Well, from my perspective, folks, I think this went really well. I want to start by thanking all of you for being here and for your wonderful questions. You guys, you know, I think had really thoughtful and provocative questions that asked that I think helped this conversation along in a really good way, and I appreciate that and your engagement. For those of you not from Earth Sciences, our new tradition is that at the end of such presentations, we unmute our microphones and then we clap into the microphone so that our people we're clapping for can hear it. So why don't you unmute yourself and we'll clap for Laura and Nano and Pete for their time and their responses here. Woohoo! And to the three of you, I want to thank you all for your time coming and doing this. We really appreciate it. With that, we'll wrap up, and I hope everybody stays safe, stays healthy, and stays well. And be sure and give yourself something nice, treat yourself nicely this week.
Thanks, Dave. You were an excellent moderator.
Wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you. It's easy with panelists like this.
Well, and you guys are more than welcome to contact me. I mean, just ask Dave for my email. So.
Yeah, I think we're searchable.
I can do that. All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Hey, Laura.